Diego Sanchez, the original Nightmare. A man who fought as if his very soul was stitched into the cage floor. From the sandblasted deserts of Albuquerque to the blinding lights of the UFC, Diego embodied violence as art, chaos as meaning, courage as purpose. He was a storm, but like all storms, Diego was vulnerable to the dark. He fell under the shadow of a false prophet, a self-styled guru who turned his boundless spirit into a puppet on strings. The fall was as spectacular as the rise. Now, let's journey deeper into the cage, into the mind of a warrior whose career was a battle between brilliance and turmoil. This is Deeper Into the Cage, a companion piece to Dark Side of the Cage Episode 2, Diego Sanchez, the Fighter and the Guru.
Diego Sanchez destroyed everybody on The Ultimate Fighter.
After that, he was a certified MMA star.
Untamable.
It was a nightmare to fight him.
I was gonna do everything to be the best that I could.
Diego would bring in other coaches.
There's this guy, Joshua Fabia. That dude's a fraud.
The medicine was psilocybin.
Diego wasn't Diego anymore.
We were concerned about his safety.
Fabia was chasing them with a knife.
This guy was gonna kill me, or I was gonna have to kill him.
Dark Side of the Cage. New episode Wednesday at 10 on Vice.
What is up, my friends? Welcome to my home studio. My name is Robin Black. I am a lifelong martial artist and a lover of hand-to-hand combat. I was also the creative consultant for season 1 of Dark Side of the Cage, and I got to coordinate all the fight scene reenactments. A real, an incredible experience I got to do. What are we doing here in my home studio? This is what they call in TV shoulder programming. It's a hangout, a podcast, whatever, where we're gonna dig into some of the episodes that you will watch on Dark Side of the Cage. If you've watched the Diego Sanchez episode, well, then we're gonna give you a little more deeper detail into some aspects of that. And if you haven't seen it yet, well, Vice is hoping that you'll enjoy this peek behind the curtain of Diego Sanchez, and that'll make you curious and interested in watching Dark Side of the Cage. I'll leave that up to you. That's really going to be your option. I'll do my very best to give you something that is interesting, maybe you haven't seen before. I'm going to bring in 3 guests today to hang out and chat. Coach Greg Jackson, who is Diego Sanchez's longtime coach, Coach John Jones and Holly Holm, and just Carlos Condit, Cub Swanson, tons of brilliant martial artists, including Diego. He's got unique insight into Diego Sanchez's mind and his process. I'm also going to bring in Mike Goldberg today. Mike Goldberg is a legend, a wonderful human being, the most memorable voice ever of the UFC. He was right there during Diego's rise and has his own Mike's a brilliant guy. He really is. And he has some great perspectives on Diego Sanchez. Also today, I want to chat with my friend David Mullins. David is a sports psychology consultant. And we're going to use Diego Sanchez's story as kind of a jumping off point to examine why some great athletes, other high performers, singers and actors and such, sometimes can fall prey to a guru or a cult or whatever because, well, this episode of Dark Side of the Cage is called Diego Sanchez, the Fighter and the Guru. Let's get right into it. Okay, before I bring my guests in, I just want to give you some personal insights into Diego from my experience with him as a martial arts analyst and just some general thoughts before we bring in our guests and discuss some of these things. All right, Diego Sanchez is different, right? He's different. We're all different. We're all unique. Every human being is a unique one-in-one, category of one, singular. We all are. When people fight, or sing, or paint, or garden, or whatever, that is an expression of our individuality, right? No 2 fighters are the same. No 2 people who make coffee are the same. We are all artists who express the thing that we do as an individual. And Diego is very much an individual. He thinks differently. He sees the world very differently. His belief in himself has been incredibly strong at times. This is something we learned through the shooting of the episode, the Dark Side of the Cage episode that either you've watched or you're going to hopefully watch. Just a fascinating guy. I'm going to speak to 3 people about him today in different ways. there's something you're going to find fascinating when you watch the Dark Side of the Cage episode, and that is how open Diego Sanchez is about his life, about his strange sort of, journey into darkness, as he puts it, when he had this guru character in his life, and all these, twists and turns throughout his life. He tells us things he's never told anybody, ever. And for reasons known only to him, Dark Side of the Cage is when he was prepared to really go into it. He also brought in his mom to talk about it, and it turns out she's a huge part of his story, and a bunch of individual people that help tell Diego's story. And it really is fascinating. When you hear it from his perspective, from his voice, like from his mouth, through his experience, through his lens, you really get a sense of it. But there's nobody like him. We've seen it in the way that he fought. Some of his fights are the most intense, passionate, visceral fights that you've ever seen. I remember personally, a personal story, when I was working at Fight Network and I was doing breakdowns around fighters, and I was trying to explain why, when we watched Diego Sanchez versus Gilbert Melendez, why we feel certain things. And if you look deeply into it, what you find is we all, our vagus nerve, which is a part of the human body, actually becomes stimulated when you watch people suffer through a fight like that. So when we watch Diego Sanchez fight, we experience something, we feel something. We're not just seeing it, we're feeling it, and we're experiencing it, we're living it. He is a fascinating guy, wonderful, kind, sweet, unique individual, and I really think people are gonna freak out when they see this episode. And I think we're going to discover some fascinating things today too when we talk to Coach Jackson, Mike Goldberg, and David Mullins. So let's start first and dig right into it with Coach Greg Jackson.
My first impressions of Diego was very intense. He was a very young kid, kind of skinny right out of high school, but he was full of confidence. He was full of fire.
He was my first guy to win the Ultimate. Well, he was the first Ultimate Fighter winner, period. So no, he was with me way before that. He started with me. So he got right out of high school. So he was like 17, 18. I don't remember exactly, but he basically graduated high school and then came to the gym. So all that first season and all that Ultimate, that was all us.
The first time I came to your gym, Greg, I was there to interview Cub, and I spoke with you, and I looked over. I'd never met Diego at the time, and he was standing on some weird metal contraption that had like some weird kinds of balance thing, and he was standing there with his arms up and his head up in the air, and when he finished to go do something, and he was training hard and almost possessed, and I said, Diego, what is that thing? And he said, Robin, if I took the time to tell you what that was, it would take me all day. And then he ran off to do something, and it just looked like junk to me. Does that sound right?
Yeah, he always had a contraption, a new thing, a new something that was going to stretch his spine and his brain. And yeah, there's always something new with Diego. He's very entertaining. He's got a heart of gold on him. He's a sweet guy, but incredibly entertaining just for that reason. He went running one time with these giant spring boots in the mountains, and you never knew what you were going to get with him. And it definitely made life more interesting.
I wanted to do one of these episodes on Diego because he's eccentric and fascinating, but also because he's so sweet and kind. And I wanted to make sure that people saw that. When his life hasn't gone perfect, there are adventures in his life that are beautiful and wonderful and inspiring. Then other times there's some difficult periods. These things are all part of the same picture, right? Like somebody who wants to find every detail possible to make him better is the same kind of person who can fall prey to a guru type, right?
Of course. And Diego was always susceptible to that. Like he really wanted to believe, he really wanted to have absolute answers. Like those were things that were very appealing to him. So I can see him, and as I'm sure the documentary showed, it kind of happened over and over again where these guys would kind of suck him in and take advantage of him, and then he'd learn his lesson and move on. So, that is the downside to his obsessive belief, is he was always looking for something new, and sometimes he would get taken advantage of.
You're talking to the same. In one sense, martial arts is a great metaphor for most things in life. In one sense, we're looking for the truth. We're looking for the facts. We're looking for the what is. But in also often what is not as simple as what is. And if we peel a layer back more, we're not at what is at all. Isn't this a part of the eternal search?
It really is, and that I think it's a noble search, right? But it does have a dark side. If you kind of get caught in the wrong currents of that search, you can definitely spiral into some negative stuff. So, it can happen, and it's certainly like we said, Diego was susceptible to that because the search is a noble thing. We all do it, but yeah, it does have a dark piece to it.
Sometimes when you ask this question of somebody, it's hard for them to come up with something. But can you just give me one interesting or really unique Diego Sanchez story? Just something that jumps to the front of your mind that is definitively Diego Sanchez.
Like we used to talk about when we'd run in the mountains, we would talk about the evolutionary forces that shaped all the animals around us, right? So in New Mexico, in the high desert, we're very high. We're higher than Denver. Everything is tough, right? It's all cactuses and shrubs. There's no like big, beautiful trees. The animals are like rattlesnakes and coyotes. They're super smart, cunning, the rabbits. So we would talk about that. Like, you're kind of channeling that nature in yourself. You're training in the same austere conditions that that created these life forms. And that's cool. Like, you should pay respect to the you tough as well. And then Diego really took that and like was channeling the power from the storms and stuff. I don't know if he's early Ultimate Fighter, but I just love that about him. Like, he really took that idea and ran with it. And one of my favorite Diego stories is just him like wanting the lightning to power him, wanting the storm, that feeling you have, that little danger, that excitement there, just to go. And so that was definitively Diego to me. He took an idea and made it passionate, made it exciting for him, and gave him inspiration. And he used it to help train in his fights. And that to me is what he's about.
All right. Thank you, Greg Jackson. Man, Greg's a really, really smart guy. Like, he's a brilliant, brilliant martial artist and teacher. He's a very wise individual. And Greg, thank you for hanging out. We are going to now pull up David Mullins. Now, I've been friends with Mullins for 12, 15 years. He's been working as a sports psychology consultant. He was working, among other athletes, with the Straight Blast Gym early when Conor McGregor was coming up. He has worked with many, many UFC champions. These are private clients, but he works in depth with some of the best fighters in the world. And he is a performance coach and a mindset specialist. So let's get him in here. David Mullins. We've chatted a lot in the past about different aspects of fighters, their mindset, training, all of these kinds of things. With Diego, it gives us an interesting jumping off point to kind of talk about gurus and mystics. And, there's a lot of people in the world of martial arts sometimes who are, bullshit artists and cult leaders and stuff. Not speaking of Diego specifically, because I know you haven't worked with him closely. What does this Diego story of the guru, where does that take you? What are some thoughts?
The thing for me that was interesting is that was so obvious to everyone, but at the same time, there are many others still functioning in this sport that are less obvious to others, that are, in my opinion, just as bad. So, like, for me, I had to do a postgrad, or like an undergrad in psychology, postgrad masters in sport and exercise psychology that took multiple years to complete. To do placements as part of that with individual athletes, with teams. I had to then become accredited with X hours of training to be able to do sports psychology with athletes. Whereas other people just decide they want to do it and they get to do it. There are no barriers to entry. That's a problem in this sport. It's a problem in other sports as well, but less so. The money that's involved in the sport now, compared to when it kicked off not that long ago, it's crazy. And so you are going to attract certain types that want to, profit from that. And the barrier to entry for them, it's basically nil, right? So if I want to become a coach in professional football, I have to do all my badges. I have to get a UEFA license. I have to do all that stuff. There's a clear pathway. I can't get the jobs if I don't have all those accreditations and those licenses. If I want to be a coach in MMA, I just have to call myself an MMA coach, and I get to be an MMA coach if people want me to be their coach. And if I have enough charisma, if I sound like I know what I'm talking about, don't need to know what I'm talking about, I just need to sound like I know what I'm talking about, then I could fool certain people. And that's a problem for me in my side of things with sports psychology, because that, like, the Diego thing was it was everything. It wasn't just sports psych, it was everything. But in sports psychology in particular, which matters to me, this happens a lot, where there's mental coaches out there. There's, they're in essence, for me, the exact same thing as the Diego situation.
Help me if you can, and see if we can make sense of this. But when you're a professional athlete or an artist or an entrepreneur or anyone in life, sometimes you're driven to get better all the time. Part of that path is to find new answers. Is there something about that drive to get better all the time that can make somebody, in this case Diego Sanchez, but any of us, susceptible to being tricked into it? Is there something in that path?
For sure. Like, what I'm thinking there, as you're asking that, is there's research on cult, why people join cults, right? And there's certain factors that are kind of common traits for people. One of the main ones is these people want to self-improve. They're looking to improve themselves. That makes them more susceptible to joining cults, to falling for that stuff. And it's not a distant thing between joining a cult and being fooled by certain gurus in mixed martial arts. You can see the connection. You can see why there's certain similarities there. So yes, wanting to improve, wanting to strive to get better, those are good things, of course. Like, everyone should want to do that, but there are risks and dangers involved as well if you're not careful and you kind of prioritize that over everything, and you kind of lose sight of some common sense and some review of, hang on, does this make sense? Is this the right thing for me to go at? You can be just more susceptible because of that drive to improve.
How about a bonus chat? Right now, let's get Rob from McDojo Life in here. Rob specializes in exposing frauds in martial arts. He's been doing so for 20 years. He's an expert in the field. Here's Rob from McDojo Life. Diego was a character, an individual, an eccentric, wonderful guy who is at top of the mountain martial artist. And even he was able to be, I don't know if the word is conned, I don't know, there's a million terms we could use, but we, the viewer, saw him misled by somebody who, to the naked eye, didn't seem to be a real coach.
Yeah, he was conned. Obviously we're speaking about Joshua Fabia, and he is, I guess you could say, the term guru is a very appropriate term for someone who is definitely a cult leader. He runs a thing called the School of Self-Defense. I do believe off the top.
Self-awareness.
School of Self-Awareness. I'm sorry. I was close. But yeah, so he ran the School of Self-Awareness. And to my knowledge, the only training I really ever saw that he seemed to receive himself was Systema. From off the top of my head, it looked like maybe he did some Systema. But other than that, he was just a talker. He's one of those people that hits every checkbox when it comes to a cult leader. And when you look at somebody like Diego Sanchez, you used a very good term. Diego's a very eccentric, extremely kind person. He's been nothing but kind to me. When I had, I think 5,000 followers, he would talk to me. He was very polite, always very cordial.
Wonderful guy.
He's just so nice. And eventually what I found out was apparently Joshua Fabia had taken control of all of his social media accounts. including an OnlyFans account, which is extremely odd and weird when you hear the commentary and stuff like that coming from Fabia, and obviously not something that Diego seemed to really want out there for the world to see. It was a very odd situation, but anyone can be taken advantage of by a con artist. The hard part is convincing people they've been conned. Taking advantage of people is very easy because most of us on the planet, at least from my job, from what I see, are nice, kind, good people 90% of the time, even if you make little mistakes here and there. But because of that, we're willing to project that kindness onto other people, even though they haven't earned the right to be called that. And so through martial arts, we give people titles like what we talked about earlier: virtues, honor, integrity, respect, discipline, just because they're good at beating people up. Well, that's a very low bar to give people those high honors and accolades when I can go to any prison on the planet and find a bunch of people who could beat people up who have none of those virtues.
Yeah, it's strange. I mean, martial arts at its best does lead to those things: integrity, respect, discipline, all of these at its best. That's what it does. But at its worst, you see some of its worst. I was the creative consultant on Dark Side of the Cage, and when we went and started to talk, and Diego was incredibly forthcoming in the episode, told us some of the stories and his own journey into these kind of sort of darker parts of his own adventure, as he talked about. But we needed to reach out to Joshua Fabia. Of course, we want him to be in the story, but also even legally, when people are talking about you, it's our job to reach out to him. And we reached out to him at the School of Self-Awareness and multiple different platforms, everywhere we could, and he never responded. Does that surprise you? As somebody who seemed to like attention, that when I reached out to him, not in any aggressive way, very inviting him to tell his story, that he never responded.
It doesn't surprise me. Like a lot of people online, when I post a video of a con artist or a fraud or a cult leader like Fabia, and I put Fabia in the box of cult leader. He was creating an ideology and a thought process around his belief structure and wanting people to belong into that, even though the outside was telling someone like Diego, which he was getting it from all sides at the time, hey, get away from this guy. He's not good. I mean, most people online are pretty brutal, but they were being so kind when they were like, hey, we're worried about you. And when you see stuff like that from the internet, it's probably time to take note, because most of the time it's just vitriol. But when someone's actually caring about you as a complete stranger, maybe take note. But a lot of these people want to continue the con. And one of the things that I see a lot on comment sections when I post frauds is people saying, well, why doesn't anybody just go beat them up? Well, first of all, other than that being extremely illegal, you can't just walk around and beat people up without you agreeing to some type of a match. But they don't want to pull back the curtain for people to see that they're a fraud. And when you actually have to go toe-to-toe with somebody who has the facts, what winds up happening is you run the risk of losing your cult following, because now you're going to be called out and create like a cognitive dissonance. And that's not really what you want from a follower. You don't want the follower to ever hit that fork in the road of cognitive dissonance where they go, I believed this really strongly, but now you're giving me an opposing view that completely is correct and is factual. You can prove that is correct, which makes this other ideology now false, which I've always believed. Well, now there's the fork in the road. Do I continue to believe what I always have because it's easy? And because I get to keep my friends and keep my social structure and keep my mentor? Or do I completely break down all of those walls for the truth?
And admit that I was led astray, and admit that I've gone down a crazy path.
Yeah, and so for a cult leader, it's their job to make sure that you don't hit that fork in the road. Mm-hmm. So by going forward and having these conversations with somebody who might call them out on something that's factual, they risk losing the ability to continue to be a cult leader. And that's Cult Leader Book 101, is make sure that you head off at the pass what other people outside of your cult are going to say about your cult. So that way, whenever it does come up, you always get the same term from a cult follower, which is my instructor, my guru, my leader, my priest, whoever it may be who's running the cult says, I knew you would say that. He told me you would say that.
Now, before we bring in our last guest, my good friend Mike Goldberg, who was there from the earliest moments with Diego Sanchez and The Ultimate Fighter, I want to just share with you some of my experience. People seem to really, really find process fascinating. I know I do. You know, when you see things out in the world, you wonder how they're made and how they happen. And so people have been asking me about the process of making a series like Dark Side of the Cage. And every one of these podcasts, I'm going to try to find a little tidbit to share with you. But today, briefly, I want to tell you about the experience as a fight coordinator of trying to figure out how to create Diego Sanchez or any fighter for film or for television, or in this case, as a reenactment for storytelling. So when you're trying to design a fighter, first you have to look at their human mannerisms. There's some broad strokes things that we look at: how they stand, their rhythm, is it mechanical rhythm? Is it a musical rhythm? Is it improvisational? Is it hard to track? Are they arrhythmic? You look at how their forward and backward movement, their weight distribution, but a lot of it is really sort of that fingertip knowledge, how every single human being is slightly different, and that is how we express ourselves when we move as well. Diego, when he's fighting, there's a real intensity to him. And even when he's sparring, when he's walking, and he has a balance between sometimes hyper intense, and we can't use UFC footage, but it comes to your mind, right? If you've seen Diego, you see him screaming yes at the top of his lungs. Sometimes there's spit flying out, and then moments later he'll be fully calm and fully relaxed. So you're trying to find that dichotomy of that full, passionate, hyper-intense Diego Sanchez, but also, that person trying to be centered to go and express fighting. Now, in this case, and with every fighter, you're looking for those identity, those isms, those little things unique to them. In this case, we had a fighter named Will Romero, who is a very accomplished, high-level professional MMA fighter. If you look him up, he's been fighting for many years. He was a military man before that. He was a high-quality martial artist. And with Will, he's able to, when you ask him, some of these people are actors that you're trying to help and coach and teach to be able to move like a fighter. In this case, this was a high-end combat artist, mixed martial artist, pro fighter, that you had to just help him move towards the identity of it. And so he was able to take to it supernaturally. You just say more intense. In fact, Will is crisper in the way that he strikes than Diego was in some respects. Now, Diego, of course, highly technical martial artist, but when Diego fights, that emotion sort of deteriorate. You trade. I shouldn't say deteriorate. You trade some of the technical qualities for the intensity and the emotion and the desire. And that trade is present in most fighters, especially the passionate ones. So with Diego and with Will playing Diego, it was a case of, wider, rougher, grit your teeth more. But he took to it beautifully and very easily. One other fascinating tidbit is the young man who was playing Joshua Fabia. We would bring him in to sort of, and he was not a martial artist, but he was a good mover and a great actor. So we had him move around, but there were moments where they had to work together. And so in a case like that, as the fight coordinator, you come up with some strategy of the way that they're going to express that. And then you have the pro fighter try to carry and protect the other guy through the motion. So it's like having a pro wrestling scenario or a stuntman scenario where one is a trained stuntman and the other is not. It's the job of the one to protect the other. But these are just little tidbits. People have been reaching out to me and asking me questions as to the process. In a couple weeks when we do the Tough episode, I'm going to try to give you an overall little breakdown of actually how a TV show like this is made, the entire team and all the different puzzle pieces involved. But if you find this kind of thing fascinating, please leave it in the comments and hit me on Twitter and send any questions you got for this. But enough of me. Let's get into Mike Goldberg. You were right there when this kid came out of nowhere. Tell me what you remember when you first saw this Diego Sanchez kid.
Diego Sanchez, yoga in the rain. Boom. That's it. Mic drop. Yoga in the rain.
Yeah.
That is what I thought of with Diego Sanchez. And Robin, it's fun to look back at some of the pictures from season 1. And Diego's in the full splits right in front of the whole crew of The Ultimate Fighter season 1. Diego was a beast. Diego came in as one of the most experienced guys. He had obviously been with, Greg Jackson and Mike Winklejohn for a very long time, being an Albuquerque guy. And I always teased Kenny Florian that Diego fought a very chubby Kenny Florian in the finals. And when I used to say Forrest Griffin, the original Ultimate Fighter winner, Diego would go, whoa, Goldie. Yeah. My fight was before that fight. So doesn't that make me the original Ultimate Fighter winner? And of course, who's going to argue with Diego Sanchez?
I'm going to go from yoga in the rain to, a guru hanging upside down, being hit with a blindfold on and the other weird stuff. But before I do, when you were sitting in that era, you and Rogan were sitting next to the cage, every night, every fight, every performance was probably wild, but there were some that jumped out different. And let me suggest that some of the Diego Sanchez fights were some of those. Oh,
absolutely. Diego and Clay Guida, forget about it. I mean, just, all out war, swinging head down, arms flying. Diego's walk-ins were epic with the mean face. Mm-hmm. And just his whole demeanor as he entered the combat zone, the octagon, and then worked his way into the cage. He was a man focused. And if you looked in those eyes and you didn't, I wouldn't say if you didn't know any better. If you looked in those eyes, you knew as his opponent, you better be ready.
Yeah.
Because he had a look that could tear through a lot of fighters in this world. And he fought with ferocity. He never left it in the octagon, if you would say, or left anything in the octagon. He always did everything he could to earn victories. And Diego was truly a nightmare and extremely talented on all levels.
You can go to some pretty wild places with a guru, false prophet, cult leader, whatever you want. And Diego really did. Were you kind of watching that unfold at the time?
Absolutely. And we were getting bits and pieces, yourself included. We were getting bits and pieces of it early on as the relationship kind of grew, unfortunately for Diego. And I remember more off the air, but I remember Joe telling me if it wasn't once, it was 25 times. This dude that Diego's with is crazy. He's a fraud. He doesn't know anything, and he's going to hurt Diego Sanchez. And Joe was absolutely right. And then as we saw more and more and more of it, there's press conferences where Ferreira he was answering more questions than Diego was. He was all of a sudden the voice. He wanted to be the focal point. Mm-hmm. And we all know that the greatest coaches and the greatest trainers in the world are the ones who always put their fighters first and always put their fighters in the spotlight. Mm-hmm. And if they get some credit along the way, they'll take it, but they'll never steal the mic from the man who actually, or woman who actually is getting into the competition in any sport. And we'll get more, I know, Robin, into the weird training and the different stuff that happened. But that was the thing that really stuck out with me early on is, you asked Diego a question in a presser, and Diego doesn't even have a chance to address the question and give you an answer because Zen Man was already 3 sentences into his BS. And that was a real sign of this is not the way it's supposed to be in any sport, let alone in the Ultimate Fighting Championship.
Well, I'm happy to. I don't know how much you've been in touch with Diego or come across him in the recent times, but he seems to be doing really good. And he's a genuinely, as you know, sweet and kind and wonderful human being.
Absolutely, 100%. And I believe that's why there was a big part of the MMA world that was confused, and justifiably so. And that Diego had moved to San Diego. Diego, with fiance or married, and then that didn't work. I mean, there were a lot of different factors going on. And I think, unfortunately, Robin, at that point, people didn't see Diego as that sweet, caring person that you and I both know that he is. Mm-hmm. And he is emotional. So if something happens that hurts his feelings, he's man enough to show his reaction. If it's tears, if it's whatever, he's man enough to say, this hurt. Like, not, I'll work through it. No, he would say, this hurt. I depended on this person. I gave him or her everything I have. And now look what they are doing to me. And I've got a BYB on Saturday in Albuquerque. We're doing our open workouts on Thursday at Jackson Wink. Thank you for sharing Greg's number with me. I text him right away. He's like, I can't wait to see you, Goldie.
That's so good.
So I'm sure I'll get a chance to see Diego when I'm in Albuquerque. And I know the first thing we'll do is give each other a big hug. And I'll tell him I'm glad he's doing well, because he was really in a bad place. And he was in a bad place when he went to that one person, and that one person took him right into the abyss.
All right. Thank you so much for watching or listening on Vice Podcasts. This is such a pleasure to do. And really, we're just making this ourselves. My friend Chase and I, there's nobody else. We just get to hang out here. It's a real gift. We just get to hang out and do our best to offer some more layers around these great episodes of Dark Side of the Cage. We make them and give them to you for free. Do with them what you will, but I hope you enjoy them. In the coming weeks, it's only week 2. Now, you can be watching this anytime, but as we are doing this, it's only week 2. Diego Sanchez is episode 2. There are 10 episodes of Dark Side of the Cage. They are every single Wednesday, I believe 10 p.m. Eastern time, but don't quote me on that. Next week, we continue moving on. This is about Evan Tanner, and Evan Tanner's story is an incredible, incredible story. That will be the next Dark Side of the Cage. It will also be the next Deeper into the Cage. We release these every Wednesday on Vice YouTube, and then it trickles out on Vice Podcasts. Thank you so much. Man, so many good ones ahead. Evan Tanner is next. We got Nick Diaz coming up. We got a double episode of Pride War Machine at the end of the series. It's a beautiful series. It was a gift to work on. And thank you for hanging out with me and digging a little bit deeper into it and chatting with some people around it. This is a real joy to do, and I really appreciate you. Until next time, enjoy the hostilities, my friends.
Diego Sanchez destroyed everybody on The Ultimate Fighter.
After that, he was a certified MMA star.
Untamable.
It was a nightmare to fight him.
I was gonna do everything to be the best that I could.
Diego would bring in other coaches.
There's this guy, Joshua Fabia. That dude's a fraud.
The medicine was psilocybin.
Diego wasn't Diego anymore.
We were concerned about his safety.
Fabia was chasing them with a knife.
This guy was gonna kill me, or I was gonna have to kill him.
Dark Side of the Cage. New episode Wednesday at 10 on Vice.